Thanks, Reed. A number of years ago, as we implemented this notion of a book of the semester, our objective was to choose a book each semester that would have some currency on campus among faculty from different departments, among students who have different interests, and we hope we've been able to do that this semester with Easterly's book on the white man's burden. Its focus, of course, is international development, one of our key areas of interest here at the Kennedy Center, and Professor Easterly will join us next week, Thursday afternoon, for the Book of the Semester lecture. I hope you've all got that information. It'll be at 4 o'clock in the Joseph Smith Building Auditorium, so we invite you to join us there. It's also been our practice the last few semesters to invite a panel of faculty members the week before to discuss the book, to help us think through some of the key issues that the author will be addressing. We've got 4 faculty who have agreed to join us today. I appreciate them being here. Professors McIntyre and Price from economics, Professor Nielson from political science, and Professor Lewis from chemical engineering. In just a moment, each of them will be invited to make a brief statement about the book, their take on the key arguments that Easterly makes. And then we'll move from there to discussion both among the panel and between the audience and the panel. We'll keep to the academic hour. I know many of you have 4 o'clock classes. Some of us have to teach at 4 o'clock, so we'll take the last questions right about 10 to the hour. Before we turn to the panelists, so there's a brief clip, Professor Easterly discussing his book, and particularly why he titled it this, and it'll set up our discussion nicely. So let's turn to that clip first, and following the clip, we'll invite Professor McIntyre from economics to begin.
We have this incredibly arrogant, patronizing attitude that we have the solutions, that we can sit here in New York, the General Assembly of the United Nations and their experts just a few blocks away. We sit here in New York and we can kind of come up with a global plan to fix all the problems of the world's poor. And then we just announce the plan and spend the money, and presto, we think the problem is solved. The biggest theme of the white man's burden is this total lack of accountability for what happens to the money, the total lack of accountability for results. I'm just really committed to the idea that the money spent on behalf of the world's poor should actually reach the world's poor.
Okay, so I can clear my throat in 5 minutes, much less make a coherent statement. Let me just start off with, you guys ever read The Onion? Yeah. So there's a beautiful piece in The Onion from a few years ago when Paul Wolfowitz took over, and they were mocking the World Bank, and it's entirely fictitious. This didn't actually happen, but the Onion's satirical news source said that Wolfowitz's plan was to just take a bunch of helicopters and randomly drop money over third world countries in the hopes, as he put it, to, quote, somebody somewhere who's poor might actually see some of the money. I guess I'm done. Okay, so in that vein, what is the problem? And the one that I found particularly interesting and is particularly relevant to me is one of evaluation. It's almost impossible to evaluate a nationwide program because a nation has other things going on at the same time, and so it's very difficult to say whether or not you succeeded or failed because other stuff's moving around too much for you to say. There's essentially no control group. Smaller programs don't have that problem, and so he gets really excited about this planners versus searchers thing, but you could just talk about scale. If you're dealing with a small program, it's a lot easier to go over one village and set up a control group, or to go within the village and find people who are identical and use them in a randomized trial. The MIT Poverty Action Labs are a bunch of economists and other people who sort of do these sort of randomized trials and evaluations of potential programs to help people, where they're actually going to have, at the end of the day, a number that suggests whether or not the program worked. That's a lot easier to do when you start with small programs. How generalizable is it? Well, those are concerns. But when you look at this foreign aid research, maybe we can get Dan to talk more about the foreign aid research, but Easterly says, it hasn't done anything, and somebody else comes back and says, no, under these conditions it does something. You have to realize that the whole problem here is how difficult it is to even know. I mean, even if somebody convinces you that Easterly messes up and he's not really showing you that foreign aid doesn't matter, it just drives home even more the point of how hard it is to know whether or not foreign aid is effective. it is almost impossible to take the net sum of foreign aid and be able to answer that question in any way that's really going to be convincing, because foreign aid is the part of a process that's circular. Countries get poorer, they get foreign aid, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this evaluation problem, one major advantage of dealing with smaller programs and building up from there, is that you actually have a hope of doing some evaluation. One example would be microfinance. They've done a variety of evaluations in microfinance. Almost all of them were horrendously bad in terms of having a control group and a treatment group that you really were convinced that these two groups were equivalent, and then you moved on. One example was there was a place where they ran out of funding, and so they had a group over here that got funding and a group over here that they'd set up for a microfinance, microcredit group, and they didn't get funding. And so they used these people as a control group. What happened? Well, your estimate of the benefits of microcredit dropped like a rock compared to poorly done evaluations. Why? Because you were actually using a good evaluation method. That's not a great way to sell aid organizations on doing evaluations, right? If you do it right, then you'll get much smaller numbers. It's not a great pitch because they want good, big numbers when they go and try to get money. And so sort of the last point is the perniciousness of this cycle, that in economics you have a model of what's called pure altruism. This is someone who just cares about helping other people, but they don't actually care that they are the ones that help them. Well, if the world is run by pure altruists who also like other things, in general, only the really rich altruists give money. Because by the time they get done giving, they've driven down the return to giving enough that everybody else would rather just spend the money on themselves. They're pure altruists, but they also like Nintendos and so forth. And so in that sort of world, you end up with just the rich people giving. That's not the world we see. What we see is everybody tends to give throughout the income distribution, but not a ton. And the model that would explain that is you care about giving. It's important to you that you donate money. But to the extent that that's true and causes everyone to give, it also means there's less emphasis on whether or not that money is helping people, right? So what motivates a poor person to give? Because they feel it's right for them to give money. But once they've taken that check and signed it and handed it over, they've sort of achieved their goal. And so the part where they go to an aid organization and say, I want to make sure that this money is helping people, that's sort of diminished because what drove them to give the money? They wanted to feel good about the fact that they gave money, not about the fact that they were able to help people. Now, they'd like to help people, and they certainly give to places that sound like they're going to help people, but that's not really the driving concern. The driving concern is that we should be charitable and give money. Once you've given the money, you've accomplished that. And so this creates this disconnect. You've got people who are supplying aid and supplying help to these organizations, but they don't really have a strong incentive to make sure that those are working, right? Whereas if they did have that strong incentive, if they really cared about the outcomes, then they tend to care less about the fact that they're giving at all because they say, well, Bill Gates will take care of that, right? So those are some of the things that sort of stood out to me. And there's obviously, I tried to leave plenty more for you guys to talk about. Is this your turn now? Who's next?
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure for me to come and talk about this. I love this book. I teach it, and I've taught it in 3 different classes, and it's wonderful for many reasons. But one of them is because it's a polemic, right? This is a strong argument, where Bill Easterly is grinding the axe that he carefully built over his decades at the World Bank, and he does it very effectively, and he makes really, really good points. A few of the points, and I could go on and on about all the things I like about the book, and if you want to hear that, take my classes, and we'll talk about it. But let me tell you about some things that when he's here next week, I'm going to be asking him about, Easterly and I have the same research agenda, practically, right? Does foreign aid work? And I, like him, am pretty skeptical, right? I think that there's lots of reasons to believe that it doesn't work very well. He is probably right that aggregate foreign aid, right, sort of foreign aid, lumped together, has limited impact on economic growth. Now, the findings on that are somewhat mixed, depending on how the question's asked, and as Frank, I think, pointed out very nicely. This is a really, really hard model to specify, persuasively. Right? Economic growth is hard to understand anyway because there's so many things that affect it. But something really small like foreign aid, even for a small African country, may not have the effects you expect. And sometimes you see that when you square foreign aid, right, the effects of foreign aid are positive on economic growth at the beginning, but then they diminish over time. And maybe that's right. Who knows for sure? Frankly, I'm going to leave that to smarter people, and I'm going to work on what I would call shorter causal chains, right? Understanding how entire economies work is beyond my pay grade. I want to understand, does foreign aid to specific purposes, what we call sectors, does that actually have an impact on things we can measure in those sectors? So does foreign aid for health actually improve infant mortality, and life expectancy, things we can measure and we have reasonably good data on, and where the missing data, the data is better than the holes in it. And that's what we're working on. My colleagues and I, with a large grant from the Gates and Hewlett Foundations, working on a project to do this. Right? We're gathering better data on foreign aid. One of the problems is the data on foreign aid, as Professor Easterly has pointed out in other work of his, is just abysmal. It's just terrible. And so he's trying to sort of name and shame the foreign aid donors into providing more transparent data on the aid that they contribute. So that's one thing. Now, one of the parts of shortening that causal chain is asking, well, we don't know if it causes economic growth, and that's really hard to tell. But let's ask, does some kinds of aid promote something that's related to economic growth? And we generally believe that investment matters for economic growth. So the question we ask is, does aid for infrastructure in telecommunications, in transportation, roads and ports and airports and so forth, and in energy, if countries get more aid in those areas, in those sectors, do you see more foreign direct investment from abroad actually flowing to the country? And we have decent numbers on that. And so, and indeed we do, right? I mean, this, as far as we've gone with this research, it's not published yet, suggests that the more aid a country gets for telecommunications and for transportation, but not for energy, in part because we think that a lot of that is subject to all the same corruption problems that Easterly's talking about. But telecommunications and transportation, which are more measurable and more direct, they have a pretty significant impact on whether or not foreign companies decide to locate operations in those countries. And so, it may not promote economic growth directly, but maybe there's an indirect path through the way it attracts investment. And so that's an important thing to know, and that's the kind of question we're asking, right? Sort of, fewer links in that causal chain. I think that's the only way, in a macro sense, we're ever going to have reasonable conclusions that we can draw about the effectiveness of aid. And even there, I'm not confident. So I agree with Easterly and Professor McIntyre that the best way to do this is with experiments. And unfortunately, with experiments, unless you can get countries, donor countries, to cooperate with you, and we're going to try, but I'm not confident we'll be that successful. Although USAID is very interested, the World Bank is very interested, and the World Bank is by far the largest donor if you look at all the lending that they do. And the Gates Foundation is very, very interested. So, as Professor McIntyre points out, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that implement these projects, they don't want to know that their process doesn't work. But the people who fund them, the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, right, others, they're really interested in knowing, right, is this money doing any good? Our program officers at the at the Gates Foundation tell us that Bill Gates himself is really interested in the answer to that question, and the only way he's going to answer it, I think, is with good experiments where you have randomized trials, and where you've really randomly distributed the treatment or the project to groups that are comparable. The only thing differing, of course, is whether or not they got the treatment. And so that's where we're moving our research in the next round after we do this big aid project. One of the things we're moving towards. One of Professor Easterly's biggest points, and I think strongest points, is that you really need fewer planners, right? Fewer big think people who want to save the world with these big schemes, and more searchers, people who are close to the ground, on the ground, right? Who have market motives driving their behavior, right? Because markets, I agree with you, usually distribute so much better than any individuals can in trying to plan distribution of goods or services, and searchers, he says, not planners, are the people who do this. We need more searchers. Unfortunately, as I've read the book, I have a hard time knowing what would be a searcher ahead of time. How would you know it, when you saw it, instead of after, the effects that they produce, right? If they're good, then they're searchers. If they're bad, then they were probably planners, right? It's kind of the implication of the book, and I think we probably should press Professor Eastley when he's here on that point. But here's an example from his book that I think is really interesting. He makes a big deal out of, and there's lots of examples like this, but this I think is particularly telling. He makes a big deal in his book about mosquito bed nets. That if you just give them away, they're going to be wasted. But if you sell them, right, at a profit, people are going to use them effectively, right? Because they've invested, right, in their health and preventing malaria from infecting their children, and so they're much more likely to actually make use of them. That's a reasonable argument. Lots of persuasive logic behind it. The question is, does it work? Some experimenters, Cohen and Dupas, actually performed this experiment. They tried giving bed nets away, mosquito nets away, versus selling them. And here's what they found. That when people got them for free, they used them. But if they had to buy them, they had a point, about 75 cents, where they just couldn't afford it. They wanted them, right? They would have purchased them if they could, but they couldn't, right? And so they didn't use them. And so, in follow-up research, Dupas has replicated this basic finding that mosquito bed nets are really price elastic, surprisingly, right? That as the price goes up, people just they drop out of the market. They can't afford it. And so Eastley's point, which I think is a good one, seems not to hold for at least for mosquito bed nets in Kenya, and probably generalizability there. Probably at least could to go to other places in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think that the arguments that he makes in the book are sound and strong and interesting and even compelling, but they have to be subjected to the very thing he calls for, the experiments that he thinks are the best way to learn. And so in this case, searchers that would actually be entrepreneurs and sell the bed nets probably wouldn't effectively contain malaria as well as the planners who might give them away. And at least that's one small thing, but it's a big point that Eastley raises, and I think there's others like that. So, again, I love the book, but like all academic work or compilations of academic work, which this really is, it's subject to some questions and hard questions and interesting debate, which I hope we can have here today. So, Randy.
Okay, I'm the only engineer up here, so I have to start with a joke. There's this guy that's flying in a balloon, and he's lost, and he needs to get back to a dinner party, and he doesn't know where he is. So he lowers his balloon and comes to the ground and yells to a guy on the ground, "Where am I?" And he says, "You are in a hot air balloon hovering 30 feet above the field. You are between 40 and 42 degrees north latitude and 50 and 60 degrees west longitude." So he says, "Well, you must be an engineer." And he goes, the guy on the ground says, "Yes, how did you know that?" And he goes, "Well, everything you told me is technically correct, but I have no idea what to make of your information, and the fact is I'm still lost." Hopefully I can make some sense of between these political scientists and economists here. Economists. So I have to get that right, too.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought the book was very good, but I thought it was very long. I'm not used to reading these long books. And my little 8-year-old daughter the other night was saying, I hope you can get through this, Daddy, before Wednesday. And I did. I got through it all. But that was probably my biggest complaint about the book, is he seemed to bring on points, but he belabored the points for a long time. And I thought he could have shortened it up. But other than that, I thought the points were very, very good. I agree with what's been said here on several aspects. I think feedback is one of the things that I kept hearing over and over and over again is feedback. The lack of feedback that comes from people and agencies as they go and implement these kinds of projects and so forth, that the feedback just never comes back on how well the projects have gone and so forth. The other thing is, he does point out, I'm going to read a quote here. It says, he states that people say, because I have studied and lived in a society that somehow wound up with prosperity and peace, I know enough to plan for other societies to have prosperity and peace. And he brings up that point over and over again of how important it is to recognize that it's the people. You need to get into the lives of the people, and the people themselves that are the ones being effective. They have the knowledge of what can be done and so forth. And he brings up several examples in the book of where outsiders have come in and said, you need this. You need to do the farming better because now you're going to get more crops. And then because they did it the new way, they had erosion and so forth. And I saw this in some of the work we did down in Peru, where we were doing a water system, and most of the villagers agreed with what we were doing, but one guy actually came up to us at the end of the project. He was ready to cut all of our pipes up because he says, I wash my water here. I wash my clothes here. And he was washing his clothes in between where the water came out and where it got stored to be used in the homes. And we tried to explain that that's not a good thing, but nevertheless, that was his culture. That's what he's been doing for forever. And I don't know if his ancestors were doing that, but you've got to be very, very careful of going into these kinds of places. People know what their needs are and so forth. The other, I really like the example of having the people that where this aid is going and so forth, being the drivers of the kinds of projects. He mentions an individual that made a movie maker out in Africa, and this movie maker realized, who was a native African person, realized that, hey, putting this in movie theaters is not the right way to go. I'm just going to put it in videos and distribute it as videos and show it on the backs of screens. I'll drive my car up to a village and we'll show it and things like that. And that movie became very, very popular there. And so trying to do things what we would think is the right way to do it is not necessarily the right way to go. The other talks about natural resource and government aid curses. Basically, anytime there's lots of natural resources or lots of aids, it tends to do the opposite of what people were hoping, and he calls them curses. I think we also, I would probably add another curse that he doesn't necessarily talk about in detail, but probably what I call a technology curse. I saw this in Peru when an NGO brought some electricity into a small town in the high Andes, and all of a sudden TV sets were there within a few weeks, and their whole culture was now changing. They weren't TV watchers before, but now they're TV watchers, and you don't know what kind of impact those kinds of things had. So now they have lights and electricity, but now they're TV watchers, and so we've got to be careful about those kinds of things. I do want to read one thing from the book. I thought this was really classic. Wherever I put my book. So he says, international bodies will review these reports, such as the UNDP and the AFDB and the UNCTAD and the FAO and the WTO and the WHO and the ILO and the EU and UNICEF and all the countries, Australia. They all review these reports. And if the IBRD and the IMF and the UNDP and the FAO and the WTO, EU, WHO, AFDB, DFID, and USAID approve the PRSP and release the funds, then the government will allocate the money in accordance with the MTEF and the PER and the CDF and the PRGF and the PRSC, after which the money will then pass through the governments. The point I wanted to make is I call that, I made my own acronym. I called it the WAR acronym, the Wasteful Acronym Review Process. Basically, the idea here is, and I think he brings up this point, is there's way too much bureaucracy. everyone's got to approve it, everyone's got to have their hands in, and everyone has to be the all-inclusive, know-it-all, know-it-how, and everything. And finally, I just want to finish up 2 points. The first one is in engineering, we always deal with what we call scale-up. When someone builds something in a laboratory, say let's just take an example of making a carbonated drink, and you try to carbonate some liquid in a little laboratory area, it's a lot different than trying to carbonate a drink that is in a column that's maybe 2 feet wide and as tall as this room versus carbonating liquids on a large-scale process where you're in even a larger facility. All the things change as you're scaling up. And in engineering, it's not just, well, if it works here, then it works at the bigger scale, and then it works at the even bigger scale, because scale up, there are scale-up issues that have to be aware of. And I think sometimes aid agencies don't realize that, and so they throw everything in there, say, let's just do the large scale all up front. And Easterly makes a point in there. He says, well, actually, it would be nice to start small, and I think you were mentioning that too. Start small on some things and just check them out and see how they work. And then go to the next scale, and I'll recognize what the issues are on the scale up and so forth. And the last point I want to bring up is I actually thought there were a lot of points in here that he brought up that were actually similar to gospel points. I mean, talking about, don't just... focus on the, don't focus on the inputs, but focus on the outputs. And same thing within the gospel. I mean, eternal life is what we're really trying to do. It's not how many minutes we do this or how many hours we do this and so forth. And aid agencies tend to focus on all the numbers and so forth. Or things like, try things in a gradual, piecemeal, experimental way. And I look at that as kind of the don't run faster than you can go and so forth. There's a lot of those concepts I saw all the way throughout the book, and I thought that was very interesting.
Okay, I just wanted to make a couple points that come from the book that relate to what we often teach in economics, and these just relate to the value of trust, property rights, and incentives. And this is just a quote from the book. He says, one of the main things that social institutions and norms must do is to find ways to prevent market participants from opportunistic behavior, more commonly known as cheating. And some of the examples he brings up is often when you go to buy food, you don't know whether the person that made the food washed his hands or the quality of the product. There's also a lot of market transactions in which one person has to act first and then the other person has to act. And so the person that moves first could take, or the person that moves second could take advantage of the first person's action. There's also opportunities where you could take advantage of weak moments. And he uses this great example of Crassus, who had a private fire company during the Roman Empire, and he would negotiate the price while the fire was raging. Okay, and then a lot of you'll often have employees stealing from their employers. So these are all situations in which markets can break down because there's a lack of trust between the parties. And what I think is interesting is he also provides ways that institutions could evolve to provide solutions to these. And so in the U.S., a lot of these solutions we've just grown so used to. So one way you solve the quality of the product problem is you have a warranty on the item, or you have corporations that develop a brand name, or even in a local level you could have ethnic groups that develop a particular reputation for honesty. And I think this is true for Mormons in a lot of places. This is true for particular ethnic groups. The second point that he brings up is about property rights, and he says another problem that society must solve is the protection of property and persons. And he has this nice thing called the predator's equilibrium, which is I could spend my time producing new things, or I can spend my time protecting the things that I already have. Okay, and so if I go and I keep producing, then maybe you're going to spend your time stealing my stuff. And so the predator's equilibrium is we both spend all our time protecting our stuff, and neither of us is producing. And the other thing related to property rights is in a lot of these places, the majority of land occupied by poor urban majorities do not have legal title to the land. And so as a result, they can't use it to obtain capital. And in some ways, it can't be used to develop trust. Because if you know that I own a piece of land, then in some ways, that's a way I can develop trust is by putting my land at stake. And so some of the solutions that you have is actually an institution we've just gotten so used to in the U.S. It's a titling company. which I think anyone that buys a home hates these guys because we give them, in the U.S., we give them a ton of money to do something that really isn't that important anymore. But when you think about the situations faced in a lot of countries, you could see a real role for titling companies emerging and providing this service of helping you know who owns what. The titling companies in the U.S., you could literally go to them and ask, does anyone, who owns this piece of land? Where does my property stop? Where does his start? And in a lot of these countries, these kind of services aren't provided. And then he also provides some ideas about developing customs to deal with the tragedy of the commons. And the one I liked is you'd have the elders go out and catch a fish. They'd measure it. If it was big enough, they'd open the fishing season. If it was small, then no fishing this year. And so in some sense, you're giving someone a gatekeeper role to prevent the tragedy of the commons. And the last thing, I think, is just understanding the role of incentives. And there's two really interesting studies that have come out recently. So Duncan Thomas did some work in Southeast Asia where they did a randomized controlled experiment where they provided iron supplements to part of their sample and then a placebo to the other half. So both groups had to swallow these big pills every day, but they got paid to do it. But the amazing thing is the guys that were swallowing iron supplements, everything in their life got better. They were sick less often. The entrepreneurs were making more money. They even were having more marital intimacy. Everything in their life was better. Okay? They end the controlled experiment, and they still offer the iron. They tell everyone the results, and they offer them the iron pills for free. And the take-up rates were almost zero. So there's just something so unpleasant about swallowing a big pill that they weren't willing to pay that small cost to get this huge benefit. And so one of the ways that we've overcome this problem in the U.S. is we sneak the iron into our yummy cereals. Okay, so little kids get plenty of iron snuck into their Lucky Charms. That's just an easy solution. And so I asked Duncan Thomas, why don't they do this? And it turns out there's some political issues involved in getting iron-fortified rice. And so finding ways to kind of overcome some of those political barriers to find easy solutions is really, I think, something that a searcher could do. And then the other interesting study was by Esther Duflo in Africa, and they were offering immunizations for free, and the take-up rate was about 10%. And they had all these hypotheses that, the Africans don't trust Western medicine, or they hate needles. And so what Esther Duflo did is she came in and she offered half a bag of lentils to the mother for immunizing all her kids. And immunization rates went up to 90%. So what was really happening here is it's not just enough to provide free services. It's that in these mothers' minds, they couldn't visualize the benefits of immunizing their kids. And so you had to provide, at least in the short run, something tangible that the marginal cost is small, but the marginal benefit was perceived to be nothing. So if you can just get some kind of marginal benefit for these people, then you can get them over the hump. Well, and that's what I was like, it's not surprising in the U.S. we actually have compulsory schooling laws. We force our kids to get immunizations. We sneak iron into their cereal. And so, we have to kind of encourage each other to eat our vegetables and get exercise. So, I guess it shouldn't surprise us that there's kind of natural human barriers to taking advantage of these free services. And so maybe finding ways to provide small incentives or lowering the costs could be a way of providing more access to these benefits.
Okay, thanks to our panelists. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and I want to turn to the audience. And when a question is asked, we'll ask the panelist or whoever chooses to answer it to restate the question so our podcast listeners can hear what the question was as well. But let me ask the first question. And Dan, I'll address it to you, and others can chime in as well. Easterly, of course, takes shots at planners all throughout his book. And this planning approach is sort of typified by Jeffrey Sachs. Sachs has responded in a couple of different venues, both in print and in interviews, and saying that Easterly's not entirely fair to his approach. In fact, there have been plenty of successes in that approach as well. Can you address that a little bit? Did Easterly, was he fair to the planners? Is he fair to the planners in this book?
No, but I'm not sure he should have been. Actually, there is a point in the book where Easterly says, look, the central planning seems to have worked, at least for the health sector. There's good evidence that this kind of planning, for foreign aid has actually helped in public health. It's interesting. My colleague Sven Wilson, an economist working in the political science department with us on public policy, we've done some research on this, and any of our co-authors here, I think they're probably all left BYU for various things. But what we found was that there's very little evidence that more foreign aid for even health-related projects seems to improve infant mortality or life expectancy, which surprised us. Well, it didn't surprise Sven. It surprised me a little bit. So even in the place where Easterly says it looks like it might have worked in health, the evidence I've seen so far suggests that maybe not. And that, I think, is cause for concern. I think one of Easterly's big points in the book is that, hey, the problem is that money's just not getting there. And I think I believe that donors have in recent years tried to do better at delivering the money through non-governmental organizations, not through budget support, through giving the money directly to governments. But it's really hard to avoid governments, right? And so I just I worry about that. Even in health, where a little goes a long way, we haven't seen the evidence we expected. Now, we used a really conservative model, and we're going to look more at this, and the data is not yet complete, and so maybe we'll see more as we go. But I'm worried, and so I don't know. I mean, he wasn't particularly fair to the planners. There was this little nod, but even there, maybe he shouldn't have been fair, right? Or at least maybe shouldn't have given away too much ground. So.
I just want to say something before I pass the microphone. I thought he was also a little too fair on the searchers. I mean, all the stories about the searchers were all positive. I saw nothing that was ever didn't work at the searchers level. And it would have been nice to have a little bit more examples of why he really strongly felt the searchers will work. And so I thought that was missing a little bit.
Jeffrey Sachs writes a book entitled "The End of Poverty." So really, it's hard to make fun of that too much. But no, I mean, he took pot shots at Sachs that were not entirely fair on that particular page. But you look at the one of the best tables in there on page, I wrote this down, 346, 347. It's the top 10 countries to grow in the last 20 years. And the bottom 10. And what effect does foreign aid have for explaining these end-of-poverty countries? Basically nothing. Right? There's no sign that was a major input into these countries popping like they did. China and India's growth in the last 20 years is by far the biggest end of poverty that we've seen in the world in terms of the people who are coming up out of poverty. And that's phenomenal. And is that because of foreign aid? Maybe the World Bank might really like to think so, but there's not really much evidence for that. You go to South Korea, you go to Japan, you go to Singapore, Hong Kong. Singapore and Hong Kong, who now make more money per capita than Great Britain. I mean, those are amazing success stories. And all of those have a lot to do with trade and with varying amounts of government involvement, but a lot to do with taking advantage of scaling up once you do it right so that you can take advantage of international markets and really pop. And if I was going to write a book about the end of poverty, that's what the book would be about.
Okay, let's go to questions from the audience.
You talked about the bed nets that didn't work, and you talked about the microeconomic. Could those sorts of things, when they can afford more than whatever the amount is, could it become available through the microeconomics? Is that a feasible solution to that problem? So that they don't have to be given away, so that it can be sustainable. They can continue to receive them.
If I understand you're saying, could somebody set up their own little microcredit business or micro business wherein they're giving out bed nets, something like that? Right. Yeah, actually, when Dan was talking about that, it was reminding me of one of the anecdotes in the book about where they charged, I think it was 50 cents, subsidized, right? But they gave 9 cents to the nurse to make sure they were always in stock, right? Just because you're selling something in a market doesn't mean you have to sell it at marginal cost, right? You can sell it at whatever price you think sort of reflects the social costs and the social benefits that are external to that. So in the case of bed nets, we just want these people to use bed nets because it makes it feel good when they use bed nets. And so we're willing to pay to see that happen. And if subsidizing it works, if giving away free works, fine. But if making them pay 25 cents means that they put it on their bed, let's go for it. So you're saying, well, can we integrate this with microcredit? Sure. I mean, why not? The point is you try that. and you see if it works. And if it doesn't, then you go try something else.
Just to follow so with the bed nets, one thing that was interesting in some work by Vivian Hoffman is they found that who they gave the net to mattered. So if you give it to the mom, she tends to cover her and the kids. And what was intriguing is when they sold the net, regardless of who you sold it to, it ended up with the dad, because then they viewed it as kind of a business investment, and he's the one with the highest wage, even though the marginal benefit of him using the net is by far the lowest. And so...
When you're saying marginal benefits, you mean in terms of health?
In terms of preventing. Not in terms of household income, yeah. But I think the intention of these bed nets is to kind of protect kids and elderly and women that are pregnant, not healthy men. But in their minds, they're like, anything that protects the wage earner, that's an investment. The other is just kind of extra.
It's interesting that there are these dueling experiments, right? And the Dupas follow-up says gender doesn't matter that much.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. Dupas is affiliated with the Poverty Action Lab, it's also a caution about experiments, right? Which he's a big advocate of, and so am I. But the conditions under which you do experiments might be very different from one country to the next. And if you try to generalize from what works in Kenya to what works in, Uzbekistan, you might not be able to make that leap. And so, but at least in Kenya, it looks like, that whether or not people use bed nets is very sensitive to price, but not so sensitive to gender. But that doesn't mean it can't be true in the place where
Uganda.
In Uganda, I don't know.
In Uganda, they were selling them at market price.
Yeah, right.
So they were looking at the outcome
Yeah.
when you sold at market price, which is not the same as the outcome when you sell it. Right, and just tweaking anything. Sorry, yeah, just tweaking anything, right, is going to give you different effects, and this is the trouble with just a randomized trial where you just take the difference between the two groups. A lot of times what you want to do is set up some sort of model of what you think the behavior is underlying it, and then use an experiment to help reveal what's going on in a way that's more generalizable than strictly, I did the following set, you claim it's one treatment, but it's always a package of treatments, right, to this group and not to that group. And that package had this effect, but I don't know how to break it apart. And if you have some sort of model that can guide you, then that can be helpful.
Cause this mass industrialization, we can, all of a sudden push people out of poverty. And in his blog, he says that that's nonsense. But in his book, it almost feels like he's advocating for lots of very small pushes that amount to a big push. But is there some leveling between those two ideas?
I can do that. I taught Angie the big push model, so it's my fault. The question is that there's this big push model that you do this tremendous investment and you push a country out of poverty, and then zoom, they're all happy and successful. And whereas Easterly is looking at a lot of little pushes, but at some point, if you aggregate enough little pushes, aren't you really just talking about another big push? And I think the answer would be something like no. In terms of the big push thinker. Right, the big push thinker is saying, you're at an equilibrium, and if I push you a little away from that equilibrium, you will revert back to that equilibrium. And so you're just sitting there sort of shoving on a little ping pong ball, trying to get it up a hill, and every day you shove it a little bit and over, and it falls right back to where it was. And your little pushes never get anywhere. We need a big push! And that's never worked. What has worked, though, is that it does seem that some countries have opened themselves up to trade and set up institutions in such a way that there's perhaps a dozen countries that have really popped and gone from third world to first world. And so is that a big push? No, maybe it's a big pull. But it's clear these people have sort of switched equilibria.
I want to say something real quick, too. I think on the pushes, you got to be careful, too, of what's being pushed as well, because there are things like bed nets or medicines and things like that, but then there's also some people are trying to push technology, and sometimes the technology gets too It's just over their heads, and so they don't understand it, and it's very hard to. We have the technology to do different things like make electricity or whatever, but if you come in there with a project that says, here's how to do it, and they have no clue on how to fix it or if it breaks down or so forth, I think you have to be very careful on those aspects as well.
I actually did think of a big push that seemed to have worked, and we can debate this. I'm sure it's contestable, but the Green Revolution, right, which introduced new hybrid seeds for wheat and rice, especially to India and China, seemed to have a lot to do with commercialization of agriculture, shifting from peasant agriculture to commercial agriculture in both countries.
At the same time, they foreign markets.
Right, right. So they had markets, right? And markets, unfortunately, markets don't always arise spontaneously, right? Sometimes, you have to have things like this that drive them. I think that freed up lots of labor, right, in China and India to do the kinds of things they're doing that are causing their huge economic growth. And so I think there are big pushes that can work. I haven't seen much evidence of that, and I think you can make an argument that the Green Revolution worked because it worked through market incentives, right? Because farmers could yield more with their crops, and they could get in commercial markets, then they got a lot more interested in it. So.
Researcher and someone trying to work at the lower levels with the people who are in poverty. And each time there's the problem that I see with sort of the economics and the research and the things he's using is he's using methods that were designed to help planners make plans and for people to look at an entire country and say the country got better. So if you have a green revolution or whatever your thing is, bring in outside industry and the GDP goes up and per capita income looks better, you're still aggregating your poorest of your poor with your richest of your rich, and it doesn't give us any way of analyzing what's going on with people in the Green Revolution who were forced off of their land and are now homeless street people living wherever at the margins of cities, and have become more poor as a result while others have gone up. So since there's a lot of economists in the room, what I want to know is, do we have any models that would be useful for researchers working on small scale level to analyze the economy of a village or the economy of a small town and its market region, or to look at things like that so that you don't have to always deal with did the country improve, but whether the place where you're actually working improves.
Sure, Frank.
I can do it, but I've been talking about it. I will now give you the answer. You can have gross domestic product of a town just as readily as of a nation if you collect the data, right? It's a matter of data collection, not a matter of whether or not the idea works. And if you're worried about income inequality, then there's a wide range of measures you can use for that. GDP per capita tends to be a shortcut because statistically what you find is that as the GDP per capita goes up, everybody goes up. Do they all go up at the same time or evenly? No, not necessarily, but they all have the same direction, right? And so because of that, you can use that as a shortcut sometimes, but not always. Sometimes you're going to want to look at what's the 10th percentile income in a country, right? And what's the 5th percentile, and so forth and so on. And Easterly, as well as those people at the World Bank, are very familiar with these sorts of measures, right? The GDP per capita gets used as a shortcut because for most things, those things move together. If a country expands through trade or green revolution, almost certainly the bottom tail will be rising as well as the top, although the top may well be rising much faster. Does that help at all? I don't know. So you can look, right? You can look and say, well, here's the 5th percentile, here's the 50th percentile, here's GDP per capita. Do all ships rise together?
I don't want to rephrase her question, Joe, but are you asking who got lost? I think she's asking who got lost.
Yeah, so that would be, I would look at the 5th percentile. in the income distribution, I would see if it went up or down. The answer is, in general, it goes up when GDP per capita goes up. On average. There are going to be particular things you can do to cause that one to go down and the other one goes up. But in general, the whole distribution tends to slide up. So if you look at China, the 5th percentile has risen as the GDP per capita has risen. Right? So yes, in general, all ships do rise, though not equally, although that's not going to be true for every particular. We're probably about out of time.
We've switched pictures here, but we could take a few more if everyone's okay for a few more minutes. Sure.
But in my experience, very few NGOs are well versed at all the concepts of international development. And it's not even on the agenda. You know, they're just out there trying to do something good, and they want to give everything away for free, and they're not thinking about markets or economies or whatever. So then, on the other hand, we say, okay, it's USAID or the World Bank, and they're the ones who are going to be the searchers. But I'm not convinced either that they would actually be able to find out what a village needs because of bureaucracy. The World Bank desk representative just doesn't have that much involvement on the day-to-day activities of the country. So where do you think this concept of researcher would actually play out? Where would that happen?
So I'll restate the question before I forget. Where would the concept of a searcher play out? How would you identify a searcher? Who are the searchers, and how does this idea work? And before I pass it to my colleagues who have much more interesting things to say, it didn't actually do a lot for me. Planner versus searcher seemed to be more a rhetorical device to talk about bad people and good people, and which I think is a complaint some other people have. To me, the idea is more along the lines of you have some program, you're going to try it out, and you can plan it. For goodness sake, you should make a plan, right? And it should have some reason why you think that's going to work, but you want to evaluate it and find out if it does.
One of the things I saw in the book when they talked about searchers is they seemed to be individuals, a single individual. Most of the stories that they gave were so-and-so went here to a university and then came back or so forth. In my experience of the things that we're doing with like Engineers Without Borders, our best way of searching is actually it's a team effort. We have people in the community and we have us, and we go back and forth, but it's driven by those people, but it's still a combined effort among a group of people. Some of those are from those places where we want the projects are to be implemented, and then there's some of us that don't live there year-round. But you need the inputs of everyone because they may not know. For instance, as we were visiting with an individual from Mexico just last week, they have lots of processes that they would like to make faster, but they don't know how to do it or which or so forth. And from an outsider's view like us, we can look and say, hey, this is where you can cut that process down by a half an hour or whatever. And so going back and forth has really worked really well for us. So I look at it as a team effort. But I think the book still didn't have a lot of strong, seemed like 95% of the book was on the planners and how bad they are. And maybe 5% was on the searchers.
Yeah, I thought this. My favorite searcher that I've met recently is a visitor to the engineering department. Some of you might have caught his talk in the HVAC a few weeks ago. Paul Pollack, and what's interesting about that is he really is trying to use market mechanisms, and his treadle pumps, are very cheap and allow for multiple crops per year, especially during the dry seasons. Very clever stuff. But what's interesting to me about Pollack is that here's a guy who was a psychiatrist, right? He could have, been, collecting lots of money for rich people from rich people his whole career. but decided he wanted to do something different, and really dedicated his life to development, but understood these market mechanisms were critical to that. And he just likes cool ideas, right? He showed us a solar collector, right? A solar generator, and other kinds of things, right? Or how to make water drinkable, right? Simply and cheaply. But what I think is fascinating about that is here's a guy. He wasn't an entrepreneur, right? An entrepreneur would have done other things. He was somebody very committed to the idea of helping relieve poverty, and then he acted like an entrepreneur to pursue that goal. I think searchers are planners at heart, but that understand markets, right? And so, I wish there were more. I wish he'd flesh out the concept better, right? I think it's exactly what Frank said. It's good people and bad people. Planners bad, searchers good. I want to know more what that looks like, and as far as I can tell, it has to do with people who are motivated for some normative goal to resolve, some problem they see in the world, but they're close to the ground and they use markets to do it. That to me sounds like a searcher, and I don't know how do you get those people? How do you invent more Paul Pollocks? Probably at universities where students like you guys get interested in doing it.
I want to just say one last thing, too. I really didn't like the name planner because I think good searchers are also good planners. I mean, you can't do something without planning. So I really didn't like the name planner.
Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to, if someone could ask yesterday about this question, how can we, the intended beneficiaries of this program, contribute to make this thing work?
And when you say we, you mean you as someone from a developing country?
Yes.
Okay.
Mali, West Africa.
Okay.
And we have received a lot of foreign aid.
Right.
And now, how can we contribute to make it right? Since planners, researchers, and World Bank, IMF, they seem to have problem helping us, and we really want them to help us. So, what can we do?
Right. So he's asking, what can we as citizens of developing countries do to improve the lot or the circumstances of our people? And I think it's a great question. And the gentleman who asked the questions from Mali, which is sometimes sort of the poster country, right, for serious development problems. A friend of the economics department, a graduate of the economics department, Lant Pritchett, as an economist at Harvard, he wrote a fascinating book called Let Their People Come. His answer is you open borders and let people out, right? Because places like Mali are going to have a hard time getting whatever product they can produce to market, right? Landlocked country in the middle of the Sahara Desert, this is a tough place to do business. And I think it's a really interesting point, and one I agree with pretty strongly. What can people in Mali do, though, given that we're not going to open the borders, right? That's not likely to happen. What can people there do? I think that you want to, try to imitate the Paul Pollocks of the world. Focus on relieving poverty, but find mechanisms that are close to the people that motivate them using markets, using prices, using incentives to change their behaviors and their production. I love the stories of the treadle pump, right? The way they marketed the treadle pump, they filmed a Bollywood movie, right? They filmed this movie, right, with singing and dancing, with a wedding and with a near suicide, right? Those are the three elements of a Bollywood movie. They did it, but at the pivot point of the movie, the father of the bride buys a treadle pump and his life gets way better, right? And that to me is just so clever, right? That you understand the culture well enough to use it to motivate people, to pursue what is in their interests ultimately. But that doesn't look to me like an entrepreneur. That looks to me like someone who wants to fix poverty and uses entrepreneurial methods to do so. It's not the same thing as someone trying to make a buck. You can make a buck lots of other ways, right? I mean, this is someone who wants to fix poverty. And I think that's what a searcher is. I think it has to be. Otherwise, you're not going to solve these problems.
I also think you need to be a good consumer in that if I buy membership at a museum, I'm going to expect them to serve me. If I'm putting money into that membership, I want them to provide a good experience for me. Now, if I buy membership for my son, they should treat him just as well as they would have treated me. So even though you're not paying the bill, someone's paying the bill. Someone's there to provide a service for you. You're a customer. I mean, be just as demanding as any other customer and make sure that they're delivering the service that they promised to do.
Yeah, that sometimes pressure can be put on the donors, right, to make it. I mean, if I were in a developing country, I'd be demanding that donors do meaningful program evaluation using field experiments, randomized trials, right? Because otherwise they're not going to know what works, and donors just don't care. I mean, for the most part, if they think it might work, then that's good enough. They just are not that interested yet in actually knowing with meaningful evidence, which I think can only be produced by randomized trials. Can best be produced by randomized trials. I don't think the only way to learn. It's the way we fixed medicine from leeches and bleeding, right, to make it a modern science, right? It was randomized trials, and the difference here, of course, is we're talking about groups of people, not individuals. But I think it's the same basic principle. Without randomized trials, we're not going to know. So I think that's the Gates Foundation. I mean, our program officer there likes experiments, wants to do them, but has some concerns, and they're reasonable concerns. But I just don't think they're going to learn what they want to know until they start doing more of those. And Geesley makes this point pretty forcefully in his book. So I'm very much in agreement with him on that.
Question on the back.
Is it reasonable to believe that there will not be somebody who is going to suffer because of development? Is it reasonable to believe that there's a way out there that can be implemented so that there is no suffering, that it is in fact a zero-sum game? And I'm not sure that there is. He certainly suggests that, or at least what I think he's suggesting is that if we do it a different way, then we can overcome that problem. I'm not sure that's realistic.
Right. So the question is, can we help cause these countries to develop without anyone suffering from it? Well, what's the counterfactual is what? Because there's plenty of people suffering right now. Right. Right. So, for example, China, is everyone in that country better than if they hadn't started going down a market path? No, not every one of the 1 billion people is better off. Some of them are probably worse off, but the vast majority of them are better off. And that's sort of the idea behind growth, is if you increase productivity, it isn't a zero sum. You've got more stuff, right? And so then the question becomes, is that stuff distributed evenly? The answer is not at all is it distributed evenly. But in general, most groups end up with more than they started with. And yeah, there's going to be individuals that do worse. But if you have in mind this idea that development leads to higher inequality that pushes people into poverty, I think the answer is a resounding no. That development decreases the poverty rate substantially over time. GDP or China, India, West Africa or Africa, we're going to have to wait till they grow before we could actually perform some sort of analysis there. But in these countries, it does help throughout the distribution. Does that answer your question?
Kind and sort of, but also then planners even have their place, because even planners can lift a boat.
Well, that's the exact problem. Is if you consider lifting the boat, raising average, and so the point was planners have their place and in improving lives because they can lift the boat. And Easterly's point is that that's entirely hypothetical because we have no evidence they've been able to lift any boats because foreign aid as an institution has not lifted any boats. It has not raised GDP. in any serious way. All the countries that have had serious GDP increases have come about from substantial internal changes of one sort or another. But I'm not big into the planner versus searcher thing, so I'm you know. Yeah, that's my goal.
Yeah, so I really like the idea of this entrepreneurial spirit, the individual in the small town helping out and that creativity. But if we look at the countries in Las Vegas that have really expanded and actually helped eliminate poverty, the Chinas and the Indians, and we're talking about governments that really reform how the market works within their country. And I guess my first question is, do you feel that that's the way? Is this almost something to be tackled from the government itself? And then secondly, what does that imply about Western aid and NGO, what role they have? And then, without getting everyone lost on the third question, with the current economic crisis, what impact does that have on these governments that are so hard, say in India or China? I mean, are they going to fall back into poverty or put up these trade walls?
Question one was... Oh, what's the role of government, considering that government's been substantially involved in all of these countries that have grown? Two was something about something. Oh, yeah, and if it is government, what's the role for NGOs? Three, what's the effect of the current crisis? Okay, number one, the neoclassical economic model assumes incredibly potent governments that can enforce property rights at the drop of a hat and do it very well. So well that we don't even have to model it. It just happens, right? So you need a government that does its job well. Now, whether or not there's other things that government needs to do, it's pretty clear that property rights are extremely correlated to the outcomes across countries. Looking at a graph of property right enforcement and GDP, it's like somebody's making up data, right? And there's some evidence that there's a causal link going on there. Now, does that mean the government needs to jump in and start, forming businesses or what have you? Well, in the case of China, they were going the exact opposite direction, right? They were actually allowing people to have incentives to do stuff. I think if you look at these countries, oftentimes there's some reason why things aren't working, and that reason oftentimes has to do with some failure of social norms or government institutions which are not operating in the ways that markets need them to operate, so that they can't grow. And I don't see NGOs fixing that. So if I'm going to look at like a country taking off, I really wouldn't be unless you have this dramatic technological revolution that an NGO could help with. In general, an NGO is going to be more about, look, there's some poor people here, and we can help them be less poor. And there's a role for that. That's not a bad outcome to take somebody who's poor and make them less poor or better off in some way. Third, how is this going to affect, how is the financial crisis going to affect these countries? I have no idea. I don't know. I doubt it's going to change the underlying fact that China and India are now doing massive amounts of trade. If there was one thing that we could do to really sink the rest of the world, it would be to close our borders substantially. They have boomed based on trade with the rest of the world, and putting up 1930 style trade barriers would be a great way to. Well, economists dream of finding out exactly what happens when you destroy the economy.
One thing I wanted to mention too is we can be talking about huge changes like what China and India have gone through, or changes that can just make lives better that may not be whole countries. And an example is we're working with an individual in Accra, Ghana, who has developed a biofilter toilet. Sanitation is very minimal there in Ghana and a lot of the places in Africa. He's already implemented just himself. He came up with the design. He's got a team of about 3 people. They've put in thousands of these already, and several additional countries are already asking him, could you come and start putting those in our country? Here it's one person who has driven this change, and the sanitation is improving drastically. And so I think there's places for everything in here of, governments that could do things, but individuals have great power, even single individuals.
Is he getting rich, Randy?
No.
Interesting. So that's my thesis that searchers are planners at heart, right? They use markets to motivate.
You can still get rich and help people.
You can. Well, I believe that. I believe that. But the searchers I'm talking about are the ones they're actually looking for strategies to relieve poverty, right? And I think obviously Bill Gates got rich and then helped people, so you can do it that way too. So the question about government that Aaron asks is a really good one, and it's not a political scientist. I have to weigh in. A book that I'm writing with a professor at Michigan, Alan Hicken. Our argument is exactly what Aaron's implying, that governments are the main force behind most of the development we've seen, right? So in China and India, the big changes happened because central government planners, government leaders decided, this market thing's not such a bad idea. We're gonna try it out, and in China, it really was literally an experiment. They did all these little economic free market zones, and they turned out they went great, and so they kept doing them, and then expanded it more and more. In India, it was more of a central plan, but still it was, governments making decisions. Now, the problem with governments is that they don't do what they're supposed to do, which in my view, all the government should do is to provide public goods for their citizens, and really nothing else. But governments are much more interested in most of the world in making, the leaders themselves rich, right? I mean, that's what governments in much of the world, much of the developing world are doing, right? The leaders think the government exists to make me richer and my friends and cronies, right? That's what it's for. And so somehow you've got to get governments to believe, or government leaders to believe, that there's an advantage to them personally of opening markets and providing other public goods. I mean, I think free trade is a pretty good public good, and providing other public goods for their citizens. That's a hard trick. That's a really hard trick to get. And our argument in the book is that it happens in part because of international crisis and the pressure that comes on governments to change their practices. Usually what happens is that when these governments are when they're challenged by international crisis, when they're weak, they look for solutions and they look for partners. And if the partners say to them, "We'll be your partners, but you got to open your markets, right? And you have to provide education and health for your citizens, so that our companies will want to locate there because you've actually got human capital that we can use." And it'd be nice to be protective of your environment too, right? And there's other things that the international community demands of governments when those governments are vulnerable. When that happens, some governments seem to make the leap, right? India and China are examples, but there's lots of others that seem to make the leap into providing these public goods. If they themselves have delegated powers, then they're more likely to make that shift. If the government leaders actually can. Sometimes they're so beholden to the narrow selectorate that chooses them that they really can't make the move. But some can and some do, and that's interesting to us as political scientists. But I agree with the implication of your question, Aaron, that I think that governments are probably the biggest piece of this, but they're not the only piece, and individuals can make huge differences. But there's probably lots of stories about people like this Ghana gentleman. He's a member of the church, right? Yeah, they've just been squashed by local government leaders who've sent some threat there from him, right? And that's to me, I want to get rid of that. That would be a worthy endeavor.
So,
Larry?
O&A through the international organizations could actually be a hindrance to the type of change that you're talking about. It helps maintain the status quo and allows the governments to barely exist in the country at a minimal level.
My economics professor, Larry Wimmer, asks, so foreign aid can be a hindrance. Absolutely. I'm convinced of that. Paul Collier, an economist at Oxford University, says that foreign aid is like a natural resource, right? It's like oil or diamonds, that you use it to prop up yourself in power and to pay off your cronies or your toadies, your other your network, and yeah, you pretend, yeah, you pretend.
Collier's estimate is 40%, I think, of Africa's military budget is coming from foreign aid.
Yeah, and it's huge. I mean, so exactly right. So foreign aid can actually really be a hindrance. I think that the governments are wise to that. I mean, I worried about it more, 10 years ago, but now I think governments are wiser to that, and they're actually not giving the money directly to governments as budget support. They're giving it through non-government organizations, which some of them are really tied to the government, so it doesn't help as much as they hope. But it's still a little bit better. And I don't think this helps as much as the donors think it does. They give it through contractors. They actually hire contractors to do technical assistance or basically consulting in the countries where they're giving the foreign aid, which might help. I don't know if it does or not. No one knows because we haven't done randomized trials, right? So
expect those governments to really resist that, right?
Governments are resisting this. They see foreign aid as kind of an entitlement, right? And frankly, so do the donors, right? I mean, foreign aid, we can only explain foreign aid if we use causal, mechanisms that involve alliance building and trade networks and partnerships. UN voting explains a lot of foreign aid. If you vote with us, we'll give you foreign aid. If you don't, forget it. But fortunately, also important in explaining foreign aid is poverty. You can't explain all the foreign aid that goes out unless you understand that a lot of it's going to the poorest countries, which I think is a little encouraging. But still, it may be doing more harm than good, which is a big problem.
Okay. I think that we'll wrap it up there. Just thanks to our panelists for their time and thanks for your questions. Round of applause, please. And we hope to see you and all your family members on next Thursday at 4 p.m. in the JSB auditorium for Professor Easterly's lecture, and then we will have time there for Q&A. So thank you very much.